Hello and welcome. My name is Nikolaj Koster, and I am here today to talk to you about one of my favorite subjects, which is the future of mobility, and specifically how the future of mobility matters to the corporate traveler. So let's get right into it. What we'll be talking about today is we'll take a look at the present, why mobility currently and right now matters to corporate travel. And then we'll take a step back and look out into the future and have a bit of fun with sort of predicting some of the exciting stuff, some of the exciting technologies that are coming, and how they have this pretty amazing opportunity to solve some of the big problems that we have, both for people and our mobility, and also for the planet. First of all, I'd like to just talk a bit about why mobility matters. We've looked quite a lot into this. It turns out that mobility has more touch points than any other mode in the corporate travel journey. The issue is that almost all of these modes, bar a couple of exceptions, they are consumer tools. So when you think of Uber, when you think of Lyft, when you think of the different e-bikes, the different e-scooters as well, and when you navigate around a city using Apple Maps or Google Maps, these are all consumer tools, distinct apps that sit on your iPhone or on your Android phone. And as we sort of say, you punch out to them. So you basically leave the online booking tool and you open up these apps on your phone and you use them, and then you kind of have to expense afterwards. So that really means that in the world of mobility, more than 80% of all these mobility transactions that we see are actually booked off platform, and only 20% are really booked in the online booking tool. Let's look at why that matters. What does that then mean if everything or the majority of these mobility bookings are actually done off platform? Well, mobility actually has an opportunity to solve some very sort of key pain points and problems. And the first one is cost. And when we ask travel managers what's most important to them, they say cost is at the absolute top, as in cost control. And if you have off-platform bookings, I think we obviously all know and understand that concept, that reduces the visibility and it reduces the ability for the travel manager to have cost control. The second one is duty of care. This is again the same principle. If it's booked off platform, you don't know about it. So it can either be in the sense of you don't know what tools the employee is using. So that can be sort of a whereabout thing. So locations in the world. You don't understand that until the journey is complete and the employee has expensed. You know, A, where they were, and also B, what type of mobility mode that they used. And as a travel manager, you can influence that if it doesn't sit in the OBT. All right, so a step back here on sustainability. We'll come back to that again because it's an extremely important topic. I think we all appreciate that and know that. Again, if we don't have mobility built into the OBT, we can't sort of as a corporate travel manager, we can't push or nudge for sustainable mobility modes. It's really something that the traveler themselves have to figure out. And especially when you start sort of looking at different mobility modes and trying to sort of compare pricing, a lot of them are still more expensive. So it can be hard to figure out when can I, as a traveler, as an employee, when I travel around, when can I pick a mode that's sustainable if that's what I would really like to do. The other concept that we have here is around mode substitution, and that's what I mentioned earlier. When you sort of can take, let's say, a train instead of a plane, that's you substituting one mode for another. You choosing a mode that's more sustainable than the other. But it's a hard planning to do because ultimately you need to accomplish getting from A to B, and you need to make sure you get there in time. So there's a lot of planning around different modes of mobility. And when you start as an employee having to juggle both the cost component, the duty of care component, and the sustainability component, that's a lot. The last piece is then the user experience. And that's kind of like summing everything up that I just said. Using all these different distinct consumer tools that sit on your phone can kind of be a lot because you're punching out to different apps and you have to expense afterwards, etc. You're going very rogue, as you're trying to navigate the world. Again, it's hard when you don't have all of these different mobility modes sitting inside of the OBT. That was a speed through the present, and I'll take a breath. We'll take a step back, and then we'll try to look out into the future. And I wanted this to be a bit of a positive story around some of these future technologies that actually has the opportunity to solve big problems and also make it a lot more convenient, a lot lower cost, a lot safer, and a lot more sustainable for us, all of us, to travel around in the world. Actually, both as consumers, but especially also as corporate travelers. Let's try to look at some of these, as I call them, the big ticket mobility problems. It actually starts with car ownership. So the car was really conceived as this freedom device, if you will. And it's amazing at that, right? So we own a car and we can basically choose to go almost anywhere we want, sort of within reason, right? Within driving reason. We own a car, it's in our garage, and we can go shopping, we can commute to work, we can go on vacation, we can go on weekend trips, etc. Now, the state of the world today as it pertains to vehicle ownership is that we have some 1.4 billion cars in the world. And if you look at some of the Western countries like the US, it's actually 2 cars per household. Now, that's how we've sort of conceived of solving this personal freedom of moving around. But I think it's important to think about for a second that this personal car ownership is really me, myself, solving mobility problems myself. And then my neighbor does the same thing, and the next neighbor does the same thing. It's not a system. It doesn't operate together. There's no efficiency there, sort of. So what does that then mean? Well, first of all, it gives us some really big problems. The average vehicle is actually only used 5% of the time. 95% of the time, it's parked. Now, why is that a problem? Well, we live in cities, and cities don't have a lot of space. And really sort of cities, if I look outside my window, cities should be hopefully used for, people walking around, me as a person being able to enjoy the city, parks, recreational areas, and so on. But cities today are very much geared around traffic and around cars driving around. So if you take an average city of 500,000 people, 500,000 people, it actually turns out if you map up the parking spaces in that city, it's more than 300 football fields. And again, 300 football fields that we could use for something far better than parking. Congestion. There are some pretty crazy stats out there on how much traffic speed has dropped as the amount of vehicles on the street have really sort of taken off. New York, there's no better example than New York City. We can probably find better examples, but New York City is in a pretty bad state from a traffic speed perspective. If you take Midtown Manhattan, the average speed right now is around 5 miles an hour. And I just checked for comparison, but walking pace of an adult human is between 3 and 4 miles an hour. So that basically means sort of brisk walking is the equivalent to driving your vehicle in Manhattan. And it's a huge productivity problem. The average American spends some 54 hours a year stuck in traffic. And that time, at least right now, is time you need to concentrate. You need to operate the vehicle, and you can't really do anything else. You can listen to podcasts and maybe be on the phone, but you still need to be alert and make sure sort of everything goes well as you're driving amongst a lot of other vehicles on the street. Another big issue is emissions. If we look at transportation as a whole, so not just cars, but transportation as a whole, about 25% of all carbon emissions come from transportation, of which this private car ownership has a big share of that. The vast majority, as we know, of vehicles today are ICE vehicles or internal combustion engine vehicles, which means they burn fossil fuel, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the, again, we'll come back to sort of what's the opportunity here, what can we do about it? But obviously these 1.4 billion cars, we really want to change them into 1.4 billion electric cars, or maybe less electric cars. The last piece is safety. So the sort of average human is not the safest operator of a vehicle. It actually turns out that 94% of all accidents in the world, on average, are caused by humans. So let's look at what then one of the solutions can be or will be to this. We're going to talk about robotaxis. We're going to talk about autonomous vehicles. Now, that is not the only solution to this problem. In fact, one of the big solutions to this problem is really public transportation, mass transit. We won't dive into that today, but the way that we see it is that what you probably want to do is really make sure that this personal freedom, me owning a vehicle, your family being able to go out and do what they want, you cannot do that in public transportation. You can only do that. You can only use public transportation for some applications, for some use cases, and the rest is really where we use the car. Now, the interesting thing about autonomous vehicles is that they have this opportunity to go in and largely replace personal car ownership. So that's why I crossed out owned by you. When I now talk about robotaxis, I talk about them as a fleet. So think of this as a taxi fleet or ride-hail fleet of vehicles that don't have a human driver inside of them, and they transport you from A to B. You are able to summon them from an app. You press a button, it comes, picks you up, and drops you off again. So some of the principles of how this will work in the future is that they will be shared. This is an interesting component because the way that we, again, are used to cars today is that we sit inside of them ourselves. And also, if you look at sort of the ride-hail market, it is still largely single passenger rides. Now, in the future, what we'll probably see is that there will be a push from cities, from governments to say, well, if we deploy these robotaxi fleets, if we invite them into our cities, we have to make sure that they don't make traffic worse, right? So a way to do that is make them basically into sort of hybrid mass transit, like hybrid public transportation type systems, by saying we have to have multiple passengers inside of these cars. Like, the way that I look at this is, and the way that I like to say it is that we do have things in our everyday as we move around the world that we don't own. So we don't own the restaurants that we go to, but we sit next to other folks. When we fly into GBTA San Diego, we do that on a commercial airline, and we sit next to other folks as well. So think of sort of the future of robotaxis, autonomous robotaxis, to be sort of a concept of a nice place to be where you can sit next to other folks in a different type of vehicle that probably doesn't look entirely like a car, and you can kind of see it on the picture in front of you. They'll be electric. It kind of goes without saying, and one of the sort of beautiful things about you don't have to operate the robotaxi yourself is that when it runs out of battery charge, when it runs out of juice, it's just going to drive off and it's going to charge itself, and it's going to come back to work and then pick passengers up again, runs out of juice, goes back again, rinse, repeat. It also won't take up space, right? Because the vehicle will go park itself when it needs to park, when it's not transporting passengers. It doesn't need to park in the city. The last piece, and which is really sort of the main component of this promise of a much better sort of car future, if you will, is the self-driving piece, and we'll sort of unpack what that means. First of all, self-driving equals the potential to be extremely safe. Robots, as opposed to humans, do not get tired. They don't need to sleep. They don't need to eat. They don't need to chat with anyone in the car. They don't get distracted. Humans have two cameras and they point sort of straight out in front of us. We can obviously turn it around like this, but we only have two cameras, right? A robotaxi has cameras all the way around, and we're not the best as humans to drive at night. A robotaxi has no problem with seeing the street and what goes on at night. They'll obviously, as mentioned before, there'll be zero emissions, they'll be all electric, and they'll be very efficient in the space that they take up. Again, they'll be shared, so they'll transport multiple passengers, and again, when they're done, they'll go park somewhere else. The last piece of this, which is something that I think is super exciting, is the accessibility of these robotaxi fleets. So what does that mean? Well, it means that when you remove the human driver and you also make the robotaxi operation very efficient from always having passengers in them, right? So basically reducing the amount of miles driven where the vehicle is empty. So if you can drive up the utilization rate and the cost of operation, you can sort of pass that enormous cost saving onto the consumer. So what I did is I pulled a couple of numbers from this McKinsey report on the prediction costs, or basically a calculation of what will a ride in a robo shuttle cost. So if we just take it sort of line item, almost by line item, the first one you'll see up here is the private car. The dark blue bar represents the lower range of a private car cost, and you obviously have an upper range if you have a more expensive car. So let's try to compare that to a taxi, and this could almost be ride hail as well. It's almost the same price. This difference here is why I can't use a taxi or an Uber type service for all my mobility needs. It's simply too expensive. And it would probably be the same for most people in the world. None of us really use or can use ride hail multiple times a day for everything that we do, from grocery shopping to commute, etc., etc. What can we use? What is very low cost today? Well, public transportation is. Public transportation is extremely low cost, but it sits at the opposite end of the convenience spectrum. So again, public transportation is amazing at moving a lot of people with only taking up very little space. And then on the other end, but it's not that convenient. And then on the other end, you have this extremely convenient car ownership or ride hail. But the problem is ride hail, taxi, etc. is more expensive. Now, what happens when you introduce robotaxis? This is the last line item. It's the same price as public transportation, which is pretty insane to think about. And if for the sort of sharp-eyed, what I did here is that I did compare the what I call robo shuttles. So the definition of that is that it's shared, right? So you can't, if you were to only sit yourself in the robotaxi, the price would be higher. But if we assume that we are multiple people sitting inside of a high occupancy vehicle that's autonomous, we can bring the price of that down all the way to a bus ticket. It's a complete separate conversation what that means to cities, because we have to make sure that these robo-taxi systems obviously operate sort of in unison with the public transportation system, so we don't take passengers out of public transportation. So the last thing we'll do as a sort of tie a bow around this whole thing is try to at least sort of look in the crystal ball and say, when are these robotaxis arriving? So I think most of you, I definitely have or still see all these stories about robotaxis. And to me, I kind of feel like robotaxis is this elusive moving goalpost, moving target in front of us. We're always told, or we've been told for many years, that they will arrive in 1 year or 2 years or 3 years, and they're sort of quote unquote still not here. So back to McKinsey. McKinsey surveyed 75 executives from the automotive, transportation, and software companies that are working across the world on these autonomous systems and operations. And the question, as you can see here, that they asked was, in your estimation, what is the rollout timeline, which means the commercial availability of vehicle service, meaning a robo-taxi service? What's the rollout timeline of this for autonomous driving across use cases in your region? And use cases, again, here means being able to be picked up and then go from A to B in a robo-taxi fleet. The average on that was 2028 in North America. So that's that's still a bit out into the future. But I want to leave you with this because I'm a bit more bullish or optimistic on when this actually will arrive. I think what's important in this question is that this is mass deployment in a region. If we instead zoom a bit more into local operations and sort of say, this will start somewhere first, and there's probably no better way to sort of look out and see where might it actually start than in California, and especially in the Bay Area. So I'm based in San Francisco, and I see them all the time. A bunch of different companies have been for many years testing out autonomous vehicles in the streets or on the streets of San Francisco. And interestingly enough, one of them, this is General Motors autonomous division, which is Cruise. They actually got the license to operate to the public, which means both charging a price for the robotaxi ride and transporting passengers from A to B in the public domain here in San Francisco. They got that license in June 2022. So it's still on a sort of invite-only basis, but to me this is fascinating. You literally have vehicles driving themselves, and granted that some of them have safety drivers in them, but you also have them without safety drivers. They top out at a certain top speed. They only drive at certain points of time, which is at night, but they're expanding the coverage area in San Francisco and the times of operation. My answer to when a robotaxi is arriving is they're actually already here. You can join a wait list. I've joined a wait list. I'm not on it. I haven't tried it yet, but I think they'll be here a lot sooner than most of us think. All right, that was the last I had for you today. Thank you so much for listening. If you made it all this way, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you had some fun. I hope you learned some new stuff around this. As you can hear, I love talking about this, and this is a big passion of mine. If you want to engage with us at Deem or with me and hear more about what we're doing around this and how we're thinking about mobility in the corporate space and why it matters to us, feel free to reach out. Again, my name is Nikolaj Koster, and you can find me on LinkedIn. Thank you so much.